To this discussion about the current state of human rights and civil liberties in the United Kingdom. My name is Mohamed Elmaazi, and I'm a volunteer with CAMPAC, the Campaign Against Criminalising Communities. Our guest today is Frances Weber. Frances is a retired human rights and immigration barrister, author of Borderline Justice, The Fight for Refugee and Migrant Rights, and vice chair of the Institute of Race Relations, with which she's been involved for over 50 years. Frances, thank you for joining us.
My pleasure. Thank you.
So, Frances, in a detailed review for the Institute of Race Relations entitled The Shrinking Space for Human Rights, or rather Shrinking the Space for Human Rights, a look back on 2020, you wrote that Boris Johnson's government has used the COVID-19 pandemic to push through an agenda of a massive assault on civil liberties and human rights. Can you briefly describe some of the key examples that you were referring to?
Yes, the key, obviously, the Coronavirus Act itself and the regulations made under it are, some would say, yeah, necessary invasions of rights because they stop us from going where we want to go. But there's a good public health reason for that. So the problem with that act and those regulations, the powers that have been given to police, who are dogged with institutional racism, so that in that case, it's the enforcement of the regulations, which is massively disproportionate in terms of its impact on Black and minority ethnic communities. So, for example, Black people, Liberty found, were 7 times more likely to be fined for breaches of regulations. So that's one area, but then it's the legislative program, like giving impunity to police and informants to commit offences under the Covert Human Intelligence Sources bill that's going through Parliament, the Overseas Operations Bill, which does the same for people abroad, the massive attacks on the rights of asylum seekers and migrants, and the also the reviews of Human Rights Act and of the powers of the courts, where it's quite clear that the object is to restrict the rights of judges to monitor government behaviour. And we've also seen, of course, this concerted attack on lawyers who act for asylum seekers, which has the attack by Boris Johnson, by Priti Patel and other ministers has led to physical attacks on lawyers as well. So that's sort of, in a nutshell, what we're seeing at the moment.
And so could you go into a bit more detail? Well, first of all, just to clarify, the various laws that you've referred to as authoritarian and draconian in your article for the Institute of Race Relations, they've impacted many different groups of people, but ethnic and racialized minorities in a disproportionate fashion. Is that right?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. Also, the pandemic has been used to clamp down on minorities and on protest. So, for example, the Amnesty International produced a report about the policing of the Black Lives Matter demonstrations, as did NetPol, the network of police monitoring groups, showing the brutality with which demonstrations were policed. Yeah, just extraordinary brutality. So at the same time, the Met Police have used the pandemic to massively increase the use of stop and search. Even during the first lockdown, when there was hardly anybody on the streets, and again, massively disproportionately, so that young black men were stopped on average 10 times more often than white people, and 43 times more often for stops which did not require the officer to have a reasonable suspicion. So you've got that kind of disproportionality. You also have the creation during the pandemic of these new units called violence suppression units, which are sort of anti-gang units, imported pretty well from the United States. We've actually got an article, the Institute of Race Relations, IRR News has an article up at the moment by Jessica Pandian, who looks at the importation of units like this, known for their targeting of black people from the US.
You mentioned the Covert Human Intelligence Sources bill, which is currently at its third reading in the House of Lords. Could you go into a bit more detail about what exactly is inside that bill and what will become law if it does in fact pass Parliament?
Yeah, I think it will definitely get through. The question is, well, anyway, yeah, the bill, Covert Human Intelligence Sources Criminal Conduct Bill, provides advance blanket immunity for the commission of all sorts of crimes by police, undercover police and informants. And the timing of it is extraordinary because the Spy Cops review, the review into criminality by undercover police, is currently underway. It's a review which was commissioned by Theresa May in, I think, 2015 as a result of revelations of police infiltrating all sorts of groups, including the Stephen Lawrence family campaign, but also environmental groups, and having relationships, sexual relationships with women in those groups, in some cases fathering children. So that inquiry is underway. It's not expected to report for another 2 years, but the government is not waiting. It's granting blanket immunity for the commission of any crime, basically, by undercover police or informants without any kind of judicial authorization. Authorization is given by senior officials. So, and the crimes can be committed for national security purposes, but also in the economic interest of the country. So that opens the door to crimes against trade unionists. So obviously the Northern Irish experience is highly relevant here because of the sort of impunity that police informants had. So, for example, the murder of solicitor Pat Finucane in Northern Ireland was actively assisted by British government agents and covered up by them, their involvement. There's been a lot of resistance to this bill. In the House of Lords, there were several amendments put forward. Shami Chakrabarti, former Shadow Attorney General, put forward an amendment to say there should be no blanket immunity that the prosecuting authorities should decide on a case-by-case basis, which is what happens at the moment, whether to prosecute. That was defeated, that amendment, because the Labour leadership whipped the peers to abstain. But two other amendments did get passed. One, banning the use of children as informants except in exceptional circumstances. And the second one is excluding from the blanket immunity crimes involving sexual violence, torture, or murder. Now, it's likely that when the bill goes back to the Commons, which it has to do after it goes through the Lords, that the ban on torture and murder and sexual violence could be reversed. So we'll have to wait and see.
And it's also true that attempts to amend the legislation in the House of Commons to exclude sexual violence, torture, and murder from this immunity also failed, as did attempts to prohibit or restrict the application of these rules to trade unions, which means that informants who infiltrate trade unions could also engage in this criminal conduct.
Yeah, that's right. And that's because the Labour leadership whipped the MPs to abstain in the Commons. And I think a number of Labour MPs actually either resigned or were sacked because they refused to abstain. It's extraordinary because Keir Starmer is a former human rights lawyer. So, yeah, people are astonished and dismayed and horrified at his position on this.
He's also a former chief prosecutor as well.
Yes, that's true. And he probably would have been involved in decisions whether or not to prosecute people in this situation, people who were government agents or informants who had committed crimes. But he must be able to see the difference between the sort of blanket advance immunity that this bill offers and the careful case-by-case assessment, which is clearly necessary.
It's also worth noting for our audience that the times where criminal conduct can be authorized also include not only in national security matters or in defense of the health of the economy, whatever that means, but also in prevention of crime and also prevention of disorder, however that's defined. And the number of authorities that are able or would be able or will be able to authorize such criminal conduct includes the Intelligence Agency, the National Crime Agency, police, as you already mentioned, Her Majesty's Revenue and Customs, the Armed Forces, as well as 10 other public authorities.
Yeah, that's right. It's ridiculous. I mean, the amount of impunity that it offers to such a wide range of people committing any and all offences, unless this House of Lords amendment sticks. Yeah, and for all these variety of reasons, as you say, it's quite shocking. But we saw, and I mentioned it already, this equation of criminality with dissent. I mean, it's known through the undercover policing review that protest groups or opposition groups have been monitored since at least the 1970s and probably way before that. But the criminalisation of protest is something we really, really have to worry about. And yeah, so there's also talk of legislation which is going to make protests more difficult, more restrictions on where and how people can protest.
And so I want to move track just a little bit, although it's all related. It is on a slightly different track. We've seen criticisms of how the Home Office has been treating asylum seekers and refugees, including from a relatively recent Court of Appeal ruling that found that the Home Office has been acting illegally for 5 years. Can you just briefly explain what that's about?
Yeah, I mean, that particular case is about the Home Office removing people who've been refused asylum before they've had, without giving them enough notice so that they can consult lawyers and stop the removal. That's what that particular case is about. But there have been, what we've seen really since the pandemic is this rush to remove people, to get them out of the country before Brexit, we saw. What Home Office officials themselves described as brutal enforcement, putting brutal enforcement before the welfare of children, sometimes the use of force. We've also seen the most appalling conditions of reception for asylum seekers. They've been shoved together in hostels and hotels without any opportunity for social distancing, without any real opportunities to keep themselves sort of their conditions hygienic. So in hostels and hotels where you've had sort of 300 people forming one household from the point of view of public health, so without social distancing, we've also had people being shoved into these barracks, again in dormitories. There've been reports of people literally being brought from the sea, freezing cold, in wet clothes, no opportunity to change their clothes for up to 24 hours, held in places where there's no sort of bedding. The conditions have been absolutely dreadful. There's been no attempt really to treat people with even a minimal standard of decency and dignity. And Priti Patel talks about the new compassionate culture of the Home Office. This is what we see.
In reference to the barracks that you spoke of, Shadia Edwards-Dashti, a journalist, has produced 2 separate news pieces regarding the warehousing of asylum seekers in Napier military barracks, where people described unhygienic conditions, self-harm, suicide attempts, protests, hunger strikes, and that's only worsened since her second piece that she's produced. So people can check that out. I wrote a piece about it for The Canary, and Shadia Edwards-Dashti's program was published on via RT. So also being discussed is a possible withdrawal from the European Convention of Human Rights and the court system which oversees compliance. And this is something that the Tories, in fact, promised in a prior manifesto, that if they got a full majority, which they didn't at the time, but if they got a complete majority in Parliament, that they would seek to repeal it and replace it with a British Bill of Rights. So what concerns do you have with that? And what's wrong with the idea of a British Bill of Rights, if there is anything? I mean, shouldn't we have a Bill of Rights?
We've already got the Human Rights Act, which brought the provisions of the European Convention on Human Rights into domestic law. The problem with the British Bill of Rights, this was floated way back in, I think it was the Cameron government first. There was a commission on it, and basically what worries me is that the Tory right has always been against universal human rights which apply to everybody. They want to see human rights applied only to those people who are deemed worthy of receiving them, not prisoners. So the UK remains in breach of the European Court of Human Rights decision that there should not be a blanket ban on prisoners voting. So not undocumented migrants. For example, Boris Johnson's response the other day to why the no recourse to public funds condition, why it shouldn't be lifted, he said, well, they're all illegal, which is actually completely untrue, because obviously if you don't have a visa, you don't have any conditions attached. The no recourse to public funds condition applies to people who are here as workers and who can't access any kind of funds. And so if they've been dismissed from their job during the pandemic, they are absolutely destitute. But the idea that only people who are acceptable should be entitled to full human rights underlies the whole hostile environment policies which we have seen for the past 9 years at least. So what the government is doing, because the courts keep saying, no, you can't do that, that's illegal, you can't do that, you can't deport these people without looking at their rights to family life, that they want to get rid of those things. So they've got various reviews, the review of the Human Rights Act itself, a review of the courts, where the judges keep telling them that they are acting illegally. So they want to restrict what the judges can do. This is what's so dangerous. This is the real nub of the authoritarianism at the heart of this government. The idea that the government should have the right to basically do what it wants, treat people the way it wants to, in accordance with its own ideas of who is worthy and who is not. This is incredibly dangerous threat to the whole structure of the rule of law and the whole structure of human rights.
I'll also just mention that whatever people may think about the rights and wrongs of depriving people who've been imprisoned of their right to vote in elections, the European Court didn't say that in its decision that you can't deprive any soldiers of the right to participate, prisoners of the right to participate in elections. What they did say was the blanket ban
Yes,
so which means that if you've stole like a £50 item and you're in prison, you have 6 months, say. I mean, there were people doing the riots, if people remember those a few years back. You could have gotten 6 months for, taking a water bottle. Then you would be stripped of your right to vote if there was an election at that time period when you were incarcerated, the same way somebody who's a serial killer might be also stripped of the right to vote. There is a blanket ban in this country. And in fact, most countries don't have a blanket ban on elections. Many countries allow all prisoners to vote. So it isn't even an issue. You're not sitting there to decide who will and who won't. And that's all the European Court decided, right? That it was disproportionate or unfair to say that everybody who's placed in prison can't vote if there's an election.
The other thing is foreigners. I mean, foreigners abroad, what the government was furious with the decision of the European Court of Human Rights that British soldiers were not entitled to behave with impunity on operations abroad. So that's the other bit of legislation which is coming forward, the Overseas Operations Bill, which doesn't grant complete impunity, but in practice it will, because if you haven't been able to prosecute somebody, a soldier, after 5 years for torture or murder, you can't prosecute, and you can't, if you haven't been able to issue a civil claim for torture or murder after 6 years, you can't do it. Now that's in breach of the United Nations Torture Convention, which says there can be no impunity and no limitation period on prosecutions for torture, because it's considered there's an absolute ban on torture. So this government is also pushing that bill through Parliament, which would obviously require, it's incompatible with the convention, the Human Rights Convention. So something would have to give, and I suspect it will be the Human Rights Convention.
It's also worth noting that the British Legion and other organizations also oppose the Overseas Services Bill, because it actually takes away from rights of soldiers as well. In fact, the British courts have ruled that soldiers are also entitled to human rights, even if they're out in Iraq, for example, if they're in combat, and that the Ministry of Defense has an obligation to respect the human rights of their soldiers. And this bill would also make it more difficult for soldiers to sue the Ministry of Defense for misconduct towards them. In fact, there have probably been more cases of British soldiers bringing successful actions against the MOD than perhaps victims and alleged victims of war crimes.
There's an awful lot of cases, Mohamed, from victims of war crimes, actually, or rather, the Ministry of Defense has settled a lot of cases to avoid them.
Yeah, so compensation rather than prosecution, I mean.
Okay, yeah.
Right, so they've settled cases of alleged or actual war crimes financially in civil, but not in terms of prosecuting.
No, soldiers. You're right about that, yeah.
And actually, so you mentioned the judiciary. I think it is, before I go on to this question, I think it's worth noting for the average person, how the extent, how difficult it is to actually bring judicial review, where you get a judge or a court to challenge the legality of actions or omissions by a public authority. And the court system itself, it's not exactly like they're radically independent from the other branches of government. They are pretty conservative, and they do tend to weigh heavily in favor, I would say, heavily in favor of sort of establishment norms and thinking, which would make sense considering.
But when the government is blatantly behaving without regard to the law, the judges do step up. And it's that, yes, you're right, that it's difficult. It's certainly not easy. They are not a pushover by any means, but they are lawyers, and they apply the law, and they apply the law to the government, and the government doesn't like it. So the government is trying to restrict their powers.
And this is even further, because there have already been changes to judicial review. If I recall correctly, a few years ago, there was a public consultation that was opened up, I think, 26th of December and closed the 4th of January or something like that, about major changes to the right of people to launch a judicial review, that is to say, to challenge actions or omissions or decisions by public bodies. And what they did was they made it more difficult to bring actions. This was only a few years ago. I think they reduced the amount of time that you have to launch a judicial review from the action in question from like 3 months to 1 month or something like that. And there have also been heavy cuts to legal aid. So many people have a great difficulty of even getting the funding necessary to pay lawyers to investigate. First, you have to realize that there is such a thing as judicial review. You have to realize that there was a decision that's impacting you that can't be challenged. Then you've got to pay lawyers to examine to see if there's a possible legal case you can launch, because there's a threshold you have to pass. By which time I think many people may find themselves out of time. So what do you think these further proposals now, because those ones already were put into effect, the changes or the restrictions to JR as it's known, what would these, why should these further proposals matter to the average person?
They should matter because they will make it more difficult to hold the government to account when the government does something illegal, whether it's police or immigration officers or prison officers or any public official. There has to be a system whereby you can say, no, you can't do that. That's beyond your powers. If you don't have that, then, for example, when rights of appeal have been removed from immigration decisions, you've seen that the quality of the decisions gets worse because the people who are making the decisions, the officials, subconsciously, they just don't need to try so hard to get it right. And so they don't. It's probably a normal human attribute, you know. So you need these systems, these safeguards, you need to be held to account in order to do the best you can in the job that you've got when you're dealing as a public official on behalf of the government with the public.
And to be clear, this doesn't just impact immigrants or minority communities or left-wing groups. Any human being who lives here can challenge environmental policies. It could be local government policies, transport policies, policies about the NHS, anything, any department.
Any public body, yes, including the NHS or benefits system, anything like that, yeah.
So finally, so to bring this to conclusion, what can members of the public who are concerned about the kinds of things they hear that we've been discussing, what can they do to push back against at least some, if not all, of these proposals?
I think it's very difficult at the moment in terms of Parliament, because the government has this massive majority and because it's sort of controlled by the right wing of the Conservative Party. So protest on the streets and just educate people in the importance of their rights and the importance of the court system. Education, protest. Yes, you can write to your MP, but you know, be prepared just for it not to make any difference. I think organising amongst community groups and obviously with trade unions, just organise and mobilise opposition and education. That's all I can say.
Okay, thank you very much, Frances. And if people want to learn more about the kinds of subjects we've been discussing, they can check out NetPol, that's the Network for Police Monitoring, a campaign against criminalising communities, Rights UK, and of course the Institute of Race Relations, where Frances Weber published her detailed review entitled Shrinking the Space for Human Rights, a look back on 2020. Thank you very much, Frances.
Thank you, Mohamed.